So let's get our discussion of checkmates underway. Ultimately, the goal of all of these checkmates is to check the king in such a way that the king cannot get out of check. They have no way to capture our checking piece, nothing to block with, and nowhere to go with their king. And so in this particular case, the king is on, notice before I said that there are different files. These kind of vertical rows are called files. So this is the A file right here. This is the B file. This is the C file, the D file, E file, F file, G file, H file. And these are the ranks. And this is the back rank for black, and that's why it's called back rank mate. And so notice how the pawns are blocking black's king from moving anywhere. So if we play the move rook to d8, it's immediately checkmate because our rook, moving in a straight line, however far it can go, is controlling all of the squares that the king could go to, and it cannot move up because it's blocked by its own pawns. So this is a check on the weak back rank leading to an immediate mate. And I'm going to show some more complicated versions of this basic concept so you can see it all laid out. So let me go on to the next one. So here is a more complicated version. So basically here, what's more complicated is that there's a pawn on f6 which controls the g7 square. So technically the black king's back rank is vulnerable because he can't really run away easily because this pawn is controlling g7 diagonally. So white goes queen to h5, and this is a kind of a nifty move because I'm attacking the bishop, and notice that if the bishop moves back, then I have checkmate on h7. And it's checkmate because my knight, moving in the L shape, of course, is controlling defending the queen, controlling the square h7, and notice how the king has no way to escape the checks and cannot capture the queen. So this is a very simple checkmate in this case, but what I want to mention here is what happens after they take. So here we have a different form of mate known as a queen and pawn mate. Notice how the pawn is controlling the g7 square. So we're threatening queen to g7 mate. But here's the thing. If they go rook to g8 now, this looks like the obvious move. Now they're controlling the g7 square. They're preventing us from checkmating on g7. But now, by taking advantage of the weak back rank, we have a beautiful little sequence where we sacrifice our queen, and I know it's very hard to sacrifice your queen because the queen is the most valuable piece. So sacrificing a queen for a rook, which is about half as valuable, is difficult to do. But here, the important point to notice is after you sacrifice, look at the back rank. All of these squares can be controlled by the rook on d8. And the pawn on f6 is controlling the g7 square. So it means that the king has nowhere to go. The king can't move up. So we have kind of, you could say, an applied back rank mate. So here we go, rook to d8, and it's mate. f8, g8, h8, all of these squares are covered by the rook. And the g7 escape square, or running square, if you will, is covered by the pawn. So that's a nice case of a back rank mate. And what we're going to move on to is, well, after this one, we're going to move on to corridor mates. And a corridor mate is basically the same thing. This is where your back rank is weak, and the other one is where your side file is weak, you could say. So here's a really nice concept. Another beautiful concept, sacrificing our queen. So in this case, we can play the move queen to b2. And this is really shocking because our queen can just be captured by the rook. And normally we reject these moves. We go, oh, our queen's going to get captured. But notice, look at the back rank. The pawns are blocking the king, and we're trying to get this possibility of checking their king. If we can check their king and they can't block and they can't capture our piece, if they can't get out of the check, it's just checkmate. And their back rank is very vulnerable. So if they take on b2, now I'm going to take their rook. You see here, all they can do is throw their pieces at me while I checkmate them. Take, here, and I have a simple mate. So a very simple checkmate here. They have nothing that they can do to stop me. And what's also very nice is what if they bring their queen back to try to defend and try to stop the checkmate? Well, what I can do here is I can use my queen and my rook on the 7th rank to simply capture on f2. So you see the queen is defended by the rook, and the king has to move away because it's checked by the queen. So the king moves into the corner, and now I simply capture the g2 pawn, and it's checkmate. All of the squares are covered, no defense. So this is a really nice one. This is a really nice case of using the weak back rank, and that weak back rank is precisely why people often play moves like h2, h3 to give the king Luft, which is a German word for space, giving the king space to run to so it's not vulnerable and they don't have a weakness in the form of a back rank weakness. So that's definitely something to watch out for. So we're going to move on now to corridor mates, which is one of my favorite types of mates. I mean, it's basically like you get taken down a back alley and basically beaten badly. You have no way to get out of this. You're just trapped. And here after rook to h3, all the squares are covered. The rook covers all these squares, and the queen prevents the king from running away to the g file. So our queen moving in all directions infinitely, and the rook moving vertically and horizontally cover all the squares here. So everything on the g file, everything on the h file is covered. We have a nice kind of very clear version of a corridor mate. And it's basically like we trap them in a corridor, they've got nowhere to go, and that's the end. So you'll see a different version of this, but this is a very good one. This is one that a lot of people forget about, because a lot of people get the back rank mate ones down, but don't notice the side mates, like this corridor mate. So here's an interesting case. In this position, black has 5 pawns and white has 2 pawns. And so white's down 3 pawns, and the black king seems to be safe here, but white is actually able to remove the pawn on a6, sacrificing the queen there and playing for a corridor mate, because the rooks control everything along the A and B corridors, and the king is just in no man's land. So queen takes a6, king takes a6. This is basically applying the corridor mate. And by the way, if you're ever in a situation where you're trying to checkmate a lone king with 2 rooks, setting up a corridor mate is probably the simplest thing to do, because you can just keep chasing the king down and pushing it further to the corner. Then once it gets to the corner, you set up the corridor mate. So all black can do is just give back the piece, and then there's rook takes a4 mate. So simple checkmate, controlling all the squares. On the A and B file, no way to escape. Just a nice simple corridor mate. And there are different variations on this theme. Here's a more complicated version. So here's a case where black has is down 1 piece. White has an extra bishop on b2. But notice how this pawn on f4 controls the g3 square. So essentially, if we go for a corridor mate, we don't quite get a normal corridor mate, but I call it a corridor mate with a bishop. So if I sacrifice the queen here, I check with my rook. So notice how I have all the squares covered here. The pawn covers g3. The only square is g2 free, but here I have bishop h3 check. So I check the king, and then I cover all the squares. What we're trying to do when we checkmate kings, just like this, is we're trying to cover all the squares. We're trying to make sure all of the squares are attacked. And so what my goal is here is just to show you all of the different main ways that we set up these checkmates, all of the most famous and known checkmates. So I check. Notice how all of these squares are covered. The king has to go back to the H file, and now we cut off the king. So the king is trapped on the H file, the G2 square covered by the bishop, and the F g4 pawn is controlling the g3 square, so it's just checkmate here. I'll show it again. It's a very easy sequence to miss because, again, people do not want to give up their queen. Queen is the most valuable piece. But if we give it up here, get the check, and the king just doesn't have squares. It's just as simple as that. So what it all comes down to is just recognizing what squares are attacked. So the key point here is just to see more and more examples of these, and that's why I'm going to show you a bunch of them, because if you see the basic theme and the way to set up the theme, then you have a much greater chance of finding it. Just seeing more examples is really the key here. So let me go on to the next one. All right, so here we have kind of a variation on the corridor mate. And the variation is that our knight is covering these two squares. Remember, it's moving in this L shape. So I'm controlling g8 and I'm controlling g6, and the g7 pawn is blocking the king's escape. So what I do here is I just simply check, and it's a variation on the corridor mate. I've just basically trapped the king on the corridor. Has nowhere to go. Can't go here, can't go here. So it's just a done deal. So this is a very good mate to be aware of, and I think a lot of people can easily miss this. Let me show you a variation of this mate. And by the way, if I'm moving through this a little bit quickly, then definitely watch this over again, because you're probably going to want to review this at least again in a week or something, at least the sections where I'm showing you the chess positions, because these patterns are recurring patterns. So in this example, this is just one that I created just off the top of my head. So if I check, I'm checking the king, and the king has only one square. You see, everything else is blocked by their own pieces. They go king to h8. And now, the mate that I showed before is called Anastasia's mate, which is a variation on the corridor mate. And you could remember it if you ever knew a woman named Anastasia. If not, just think of it as the corridor mate. But anyway, here we can brutally sacrifice our queen on h7. And I put the queen on b1 just to make this distance extra long and have the rook move long distance across the board. But look at how all of the squares are covered. That's how you checkmate the king here. You see? g8 is covered. g6 is covered. Cover everything here. Take. We have mate. Let me show it again. So basically, really what this comes down to is just realizing that you're controlling all of the king's escape squares with your knight, and you're covering all the squares on the h-file with your rook. Take, take, rook h3 check. All they can do is block for a move, we take it, and it's checkmate. So being aware of all of these checkmates is going to be very useful for you, because you may have games where the opponent is just careless and just falls into the mate, or they might not even know about the mate. That can happen too. So this is a very useful one to be aware of. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, here's a really simple one. The queen and pawn mate. And I discussed it before. Basically, we're going queen g7 mate. Nothing complicated, but again, good to look at it in the simplest, purest form, just to make sure you're familiar with it, just to be as clear as possible on it. So that's a good one to be aware of. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so this one is called Damiano's mate. Damiano was a player from the, lived in the 1400s and 1500s, and he was a player who executed this mate multiple times. And the checkmate here is just queen to h7. And the reason why it's checkmate is that the pawn controls the f7 square, controls the h7 square, and everything is under control. And notice that the king is blocked by their own piece. So oftentimes checkmates work because the defensive side just is simply blocked in. They're locked in by their own pieces. It's like when you're trapped in a train and you can't move. That's basically what happens here with the black king. So I'll show you a nice variation on this same mate here. Okay. So here's an interesting case of it. Black is up a rook and a bishop for white's 2 pawns on the queen side. But here, and I also want to make a point here, in terms of playing energetically and playing with force, to play with force here with white would mean to play for checks. Because when you're playing direct checks, they have to react to the check. And what we can do here to set up Damiano's mate is I don't want to check on c4 because then they can block the check with a piece. So I'm going to play rook h8 check. Here's the point. King takes h8. I have queen h4 check. And now if king to g8, I have queen h7 mate. I've sacrificed a rook with tempo, and when we say with tempo, we mean with time. So we're gaining time, we're doing it by force, and then we swing the queen over with check, and as I said, when the king is in check, they have to react to the check, so they move the king over, and then we have Damiano's mate. So this was just a case of setting up Damiano's mate, and it's not that difficult of a concept, but you know, when you've seen the mate, you have to see different ways to apply the mate, and then it's much easier to do it yourself. So with all of the common mates, you're going to want to see the most typical sorts of examples of executing them. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, here's one of my favorite ones, Grieco's mate. And this is a lot like a corridor mate because we're having the bishop control the g8 square. So here we just simply go queen h5, and notice how our queen is controlling h6, h7, and g8. And our bishop is preventing the king from escaping via g8 because we just simply control it. So everything is under control and white just wins on the spot. So queen h5 check is a nice execution of Grieco's mate. And I'll show you how I applied the idea during a game, just so you can see it in a kind of complicated form actually. So I had this position against a 2300 player, a FIDE master, and I must say my opponent was totally shocked when I executed this, when I played this. So I'll show you the sequence I played. Notice that my queen is attacked by their knight on f7, and my queen is undefended here, so it's not like I'm going to play bishop takes f7 and lose my queen on g5. So what I played here was I played rook takes f7. So I'm threatening mate here. They played rook takes f7. And now, here's where you see the value in knowing about Grieco's mate and being very familiar with that pattern. So what I did here was I played rook takes h7 check. Take. Take. Check. King to g8. Now I took with the queen, and now I finally am able to set up Grieco's mate because I have queen h5 and I'm preventing king to g8. King h7, queen h5 was checkmate. My queen covers all the squares on the h-file, covers g6, and my bishop is conveniently preventing the king from escaping via g8. So you might wonder, oh, well, who would this work against? Well, it worked against the FIDE master, so sometimes these things work against anybody. I mean, Vladimir Kramnik was world champion and he fell for a mate and won. So, you know, you never know what somebody can fall for. So you always have to keep your eyes peeled for these mates, be very aware of them, and just get more and more familiar with these types of executions of them. So let me go on to the next one. Here's a nice mate, and I'm showing the long-range version of it. And this is called the Paulette mate. And it's kind of an old classic mate, you know, where they have the two rooks blocking the king. So the rook is just preventing the king from running away. And the queen covers d7, e7, f7, and also covers the e8 square by checking. So with one single check, we have a mate, and there's nothing that can be done. So it's always good to be aware of these direct checkmates like queen e6. And if it's a long-range move, like a queen moving from a6 or from h3, it's very easy to miss these moves. So it's really good to also kind of conceptualize it. What am I trying to do? Well, trying to prevent the king from being able to run away while being in check, controlling all the squares. Queen e6 does it nicely with an Paulette mate. So what's the next one here? Oh yeah, here's one that I call a Christmas tree mate. Basically, my queen here is controlling all of these squares. And what you'll also see is the f7 pawn for black is controlling these squares. So the king has all these squares covered by the queen, and then the two remaining squares covered by the f7 pawn. So there's no way to get out of that. We just go queen to f4 checkmate. So that's a good one to be aware of. And it can be sometimes hard to wrap your head around, are you controlling all the squares? And that's why it's good to kind of see it and think about what squares are your pieces controlling. Because this was a little bit hard for me when I started, just being aware of, well, am I covering all the squares? But that's why these checkmating patterns are so valuable, because you see that you're controlling everything. And after this, we're going to look at queen traps. And the queen traps are even, I would say, even more tricky, because you have to be aware that the queen is unable to move. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, so here's a classic, the smothered mate, where the knight just smothers the king, and the king is simply unable to move, blocked in by his own pieces. So this is the classic smothered mate. And during a game, you're almost never, rarely are going to get a clear-cut just knight f7 mate, but that's why you often will have to create it. So let me show you a typical example. Here's an example right here. So black has these rooks here. It looks like they're nearby, ready to defend. I play knight f7 check. So I'm checking the king. They must react. If they take with the rook, the problem is, look at their back rank. Their back rank now has no defense, so we can play for a back rank checkmate. All they can do is block and give up their rooks. We just take them with our queen, and we have a simple checkmate because they just can't get out of check, and we mated them on the back rank. But here's how we execute. Here's how we execute the smothered mate here. We get a double check. Double checks are very valuable to be aware of. I'm checking with the knight, and I'm checking with the queen. When you're double checking, the opponent always has to move their king, because they cannot remain in check after their move. So they have to move the king. And here, what we do is we decoy their rook with the excellent queen to g8 check. The first position I was ever quizzed on by a professional player was a smothered mate just like this. And it was almost insulting to my chess skill, because I've been playing for a couple of years and they showed me this, but this is a good one to be aware of. This is a nice pattern to know, that we distract the rook from f8 to g8, so that now the king is trapped in the corner, and then we just smother that guy. Just can't get out. So yeah, he's suffocated. There's also a checkmate called a suffocation mate, where it's similar to this, where the king is just basically mated by a knight and is unable to get out of the checks. So let's go on to the next one. Okay, here's one that's very easy to miss. It's called the hook mate. And you have a hook that's supporting your f6 knight, and you play rook to e8 mate. And the point is, our rook is controlling d8, e8, f8, and all of the squares on the e-file, e8, e7, e6. Our pawn controls d6 and f6, and our knight is controlling d7. This is a good pattern to commit to memory. And notice how the f7 pawn is blocking the black king from running away. So this is quite a valuable checkmating pattern that's really easy to miss. If you haven't seen it before, it's not that easy to realize it if you haven't seen it before, but that's exactly why I'm showing you the pure distilled version of it. So let's go on and look at some more of these. This one is called the Arabian mate, and this happens when you have a knight. I mean, there are different versions of it, but here's a typical one with a knight on f6, just supporting rook to h7 mate. And you see how the rook is defended, and the king is attacked on h8 and can't go to g8 either, because the knight covers that square too. So the Arabian mate is something you have to watch out for if the king is in the corner and there's a knight very close by, if there's a rook that can come down to, let's say, a square just like this one, h7, can be bad news for the defensive side. So here's one which I think is good just from the perspective of being eye-opening. So in this position, the knights control a lot of squares. You know, you see the knight here controls this and this. The knight here controls e5 and g5. And the bishop on d2 controls f4. Knight on e4 is blocking. The h3 pawn is controlling g4. So notice how everything is controlled. So all we need is to check the king. If we can get one check in, it's checkmate. So we go g2, g4, and it's checkmate. And I think this might be shocking to some people because it might be kind of visually hard to appreciate that you're controlling all the squares. But just take a look again. Your knights control all of this. Everything else is defended. So these kinds of mates are sometimes ones that can be a little bit tricky to spot. But if you spot it and recognize it, you'll definitely catch on to realizing that all the squares are controlled. So it's a little tricky to see, but once you see it, you'll recognize it. So that's a nice one. I like this one quite a lot. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, so I wanted to show a couple of bishop checkmates. And here's a simple one. When you have two bishops against the king, just a lone king here, the simplest way to win is chase the king into the corner, either corner. You check. Notice how the bishop covers the f8 square. So we're just kind of slicing through the position. King has to go to the corner. We go bishop e5, checkmate. And you see how all the squares are covered, and the king covers the h7 square, so it can't move up. This is a nice thing to be aware of, because if the king is in the corner and there are bishops just kind of mowing them down this way, it can easily be a checkmate. So that's something to be aware of. One of the harder mates right here is called Boden's mate. And what's tricky about Boden's mate is that we have crisscrossing bishops that control all four squares to lead us to mate. See this? b8, c7, b7, c8. So we control all the squares with bishop a6 mate. Here and here. And notice how the d8 and d7 squares are occupied by pieces, so the king can't run to those squares. So this is a nice crisscrossing kind of power of the bishops. And I'll show an application of this same idea, but you're probably going to want to watch this a couple of times just to be really familiar with these types of things. And you may even want to set up a chessboard and just kind of play it out. So here's kind of a funny illustration of it. We're down a bishop for rook, and they also have an extra pawn. But what we have here, notice the black king has no squares. When you notice that the black king is cut off like this, you can see that they have potential king weakness problems. So it can be very difficult to defend this. And what you'll see here is there's the beautiful move, queen takes c6 check, which looks totally shocking because you'd think, I'm just losing my queen. They just take with the pawn. And you see your threatening mate on c7. Well, they don't have any move to block with, so we're just mating unless they capture it. But now we get to execute Boden's mate. The exact mating pattern that I showed you before. Here and here. And our bishops slice through the position, controlling all four of these squares. b7, c8, b8, c7. Just a nice simple checkmate there. So that works out perfectly. And let's see what else we have here. Okay, I'll show you a couple of cases of the escape square for the king, where a king tries to run away, but is covered. And what you can see here, you see the bishop covers the e7 square. So the king would like to run away, but it can't. So I check on h7. I have my rook and my queen attacking the king. And here I play the surprising move, queen to h8 check. I give up my queen, but the whole point is I give up my queen, they take it, and then I have rook takes h8 mate. And this is just kind of a variation on back rank mate, because it's like a back rank mate, but they just can't walk their king up. So I'm just controlling all the squares on their back rank. I'm covering e7. They have nothing they can do, so I'll just show it again. Queen h7, queen h8 check, giving up the queen, and then a nice mate. So I think there's some harder ones coming up here. Okay, here's an interesting one. Here's an interesting one. We're playing black. The white king is quite vulnerable on h4. Since it's so vulnerable there, I would love to try to check it. Notice how it has no safe squares. All the squares are covered. Of course, if I go g5 check, the king comes to h5. It has only one safe square. I don't want to check and then allow the king to run back. So I don't want to go rook e4 check. But if I play... So what I'm thinking here is, what are the forcing checks I can play? If I check, the king comes to h5. Okay. Important lesson here is, if I had one good check against that king, I would be checkmating. So what that means is, well, I need to try to look for any way to checkmate it. And if I don't have a checkmate, things may not be so great for me. So with black here, I'm thinking, okay, well, I have two checks. I can go rook takes h3 check, and then their pawn will take it. Or I can play bishop f3 check, and their pawn will take it. Well, I would love to check with my bishop, because then it would just be checkmate. And so what I can do is I can decoy or overload their g2 pawn. Take. And then here is a very nice case of checkmating with minimal force. I play bishop f3. You see all the squares are covered. All the squares are covered, and the king is just shot and killed. Nothing to do here. Bishop f3 is mate. So a nice case of all the squares being covered. The pawns cover everything, and the king covers everything over here. So a nice case of a straightforward checkmate, but we were forced to sacrifice our rook. For some people, this might be a hard move, but we're removing the defender of the f3 square, then checking with our bishop and mating. So let's go. This is a nice one too. I love this one. So here, there are 2 points. So the king has a pretty hefty role here of defending the queen. You know, the queen is the most valuable piece. So in this particular case, here's the thing. If I check the king will run away. And when the king runs away, I don't have a direct win. So what I want to do instead is I want to block the king's route, block the king's escape route. So I play the shocking check e5. Here's the point. White has only 2 ways to play. They can either take, okay, if they take with the king, then they lose their queen. And once they lose their queen, I'm just going to gobble up all the pawns and the game will be over, which is the easiest strategy in these types of positions. You know, like take, and I'm going to take here, and then I'm going to gobble this up, come back, gobble this up. I'm just going to go boop, 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 boop. Just push the pawn all the way down, queen a new pawn. As I was saying before, when you have a position like this, you just run in. Okay, I don't even need to capture that pawn, but in a position like this, just to keep it really simple, just queen your pawn really, really quickly. You know, have your 2 queens and checkmate the king because they control so many squares. It's quite simple. So if I play e5, the point is I'm blocking the king's escape route. And blocking an escape route, kind of setting them up in a mating net, is a pretty advanced idea. But it can sometimes just be a one mover like this. And now, take a look. It's checkmate. My pawn on f5 controls these squares. My queen controls all of these. And the rest of the squares are blocked by their own pieces. So, e5 is a fantastic blocking move, putting white's king in a mating net. D takes e5, queen d2, checkmate. So, one of my personal favorite ideas. Okay, actually, here's a really nice one. Remember, I was talking about double check and how powerful it is. If you have double check, the opponent has to react to it. So you could kind of look at it this way. The queen on h6 is kind of like a security guard. It's the only It's the only guard of the g7 pawn. And so basically with white, I'm thinking here, well, I'm willing to do anything to get rid of the guard, because if that guard is gone, I'm going to take the crown jewel. It's all mine. So I'm going queen h3. This is a pretty fantastic move. It's a distractionary move. I'm giving up my whole queen. They take. And what I'm going to do here is look at my bishops slicing through the position. So I'm going to take the g7 pawn with my rook. They have to go to the corner. Here's the important thing. Remember, when we're checkmating, we're controlling all the squares. So I'm just removing their ability to move for their king. Really, the king's only square now is g8. It has to go back. So they try to give up the knight. But take a look at how I checkmate the king here. See my bishops just slicing through? You remember I showed a position before where it was a checkmate with a king in the corner, checkmated by two bishops, just kind of slicing through everything. So here I play rook g7, double check, king to h8, and then I have a very nice double check with rook g8 and mate. It's a double check because I'm checking with the rook and I'm checking with the bishop. And when you're double checked and you have nowhere to run to, then it's simply mate. So this is a very nice double check and mate as well. So let's see, what else do we have here? Oh yeah, this one is interesting from the perspective of covering squares. And what you can see here is you can see white's rook. I'm covering the e-file. My pawn is covering g4. My queen is covering everything else. And my pawn is covering f6. So you can see almost all the squares for the king are covered. So I'm looking for ways to checkmate the king. So I play knight to h4 check, that being one of my only checks. And take a look at the squares. Covered by my rook, the rook on e1. This is covered by my pawn on g5 and my queen. So all of these are covered. The pawn on h3 covers g4. They go king to f4. And here, it's a little surprising, but I have a checkmate with the simple g6 mate. And take a look at how all the squares are covered. Notice the coordination and the cooperation I have. I have my rook covering the e-file. I have my queen covering these diagonal squares. I have my knight covering f5 and f3. I have my pawn covering g3, and I have my other pawn covering g4. So I have 5 pieces working together to control all the squares of the black king. So that's a pretty amazing idea, but as you can see, sometimes chess just works that way. You checkmate the king like this, your pieces coordinate together, and as you can see, this is a good example of why we don't just attack with one piece, because there are a lot of squares to cover if the king is out in the open. So we need to be more exact than that. So I want to show a more complicated case. Here, I can try to play a queen and pawn mate by trying to sneak my queen in here. The only problem is that they have the nice move knight to e8 covering the g7 square. So in this case, I don't have a checkmate. So what I have to play instead is I have a very nice tricky idea, and I call this basically disrupting the lines of communication. I check with my knight. Okay, see how I'm checking the king. My h6 pawn is covering the g7 square, so the king must go away, must go into the corner. And now I have the fantastic move knight to e8. And remember, the point of knight e8 is that now if they take with the knight, I have chased the king away so that now the rook is not defended anymore, and I have a simple checkmate. It's again much like a back rank mate. So I've destroyed their lines of communication, and I've prevented their knight from defending. So if they take, I simply go queen check, and I have my queen and pawn mate. So it's a really, really nice case of preventing both of their ideas, preventing the knight capture and preventing the rook capture. So it just works out perfectly. If they move the king over, I will take their knight, and then I have my queen and pawn standard mate. So that works out perfectly as well. And here's the hardest one in the whole collection, but the basic idea is if you can't checkmate the king right away, like for instance in this case, if we check the king, what might happen is the king might just run away. And the problem is if the king runs away, then we aren't able to get a direct win. And we might just be down. I mean, here, for instance, we're down a rook. The opponent has an extra rook, so we have to be very careful about that. So what we do here is pretty much an amazing move. Basically, you know, it's like there's a home invasion here, and the king is just trying to run away. It's like, okay, I'm about to get robbed. I need to run away. Need to stay safe. And white goes, you know what? I'm a sniper here. I have my bishop right here. I'm going to put it on this diagonal right here, and the king is not going to be able to run away. If the bishop comes out to a3, one single check on h7 will cover all the squares, and it'll be checkmate. So black tries his best. Queen d6, and then I go queen to h6. Now I'm threatening the bishop, and I'm also threatening to check the king with the rook when the king is almost out of squares. So after bishop g7, I check here. Now I have the very nice rook to g3. Again, I'm threatening the bishop. So the bishop moves, bishop to f6, kind of defending itself. And now I play the surprising c5. And the point of this is, if they take it, I will take with my pawn. And now I've opened up, I've attacked the queen, and I've opened up an attack on the bishop. We would call this a double attack. Double attacks are very, very effective tactically, because if you're attacking two things at once, you may just overstretch the defenses and prevent them from being able to defend. So this would just be a nice, straightforward way to win with white. So what I was looking at was them playing queen c7, but here I have the very nice c6. And here's the point. If they take it, what I get to do is I get to block the escape route. I'm blocking their ability to evacuate the building. Check. And if they block, now you can see they cannot run away. I can just checkmate like this. All the squares are covered. Everything's covered here. King has nowhere to go. So this is a really nice case of playing a really, I mean, what's shocking about this is we call this a quiet move. We're looking for the brutal captures, and then suddenly, I mean, most people, I guess, would go would take this pawn on h7 and let the king run away. But the important thing here is, if you don't have a mate, but you may have the possibility of trapping the king, if you can trap them in a mating net, in a checkmating net that they can't break out of, then a move like this, a pawn move on this side of the board, can be really, really effective. So a4 is a great move. So these are the positions on checkmating. I definitely recommend that you look them over multiple times. I think you should look these over, 2, 3, 4, even 4 times if you want to. But these are very valuable to kind of commit to memory, because these are the most common checkmates, and I sort of only learned them after I'd been playing for a little while. I kind of picked them up sort of randomly. I didn't learn them systematically and just kind of see them all. But the point is, we saw the mates with the queen. We saw the mates with the bishop. We saw the mates with the knight. We saw the smothered mate, suffocation mate, all these, the hook mate. We saw mates that occurred with all the pieces, with the rooks. So, when you see how all of the pieces can be in their element and shine in their strongest element, that gives you also some insight into how to use the pieces. So next we're going to move on to how to trap the queen, which is something almost nobody ever really thinks about.